Welcome to Count Me In. I'm your host, Adam Larson, and today we have a special guest with us, Michael Housman, founder and CEO of AI-ccelerator. Michael's journey is a fascinating one, transitioning from academia to the private sector, driven by his passion for data and coding. His career highlights include roles in healthcare, HR tech, e-commerce, and now fintech. In this episode, we'll explore how AI is revolutionizing fintech, particularly in credit scoring and underwriting. We'll discuss how some companies are leveraging AI to serve niche markets, the importance of career flexibility, and how human intuition can collaborate with AI to combat fraud. We'll cover the challenges and best practices in AI adoption and internal AI policies. This episode has valuable insights that you won't want to miss. Let's get started. Well, Mike, I'm really excited to have you on the Count Me In podcast. And you've got such an interesting background where you started with, you had a PhD and now you're leading an organization in fintech. Maybe we can start by talking a little bit about your story and how you got from PhD to the fintech space.
Yeah, it has been a very weird and winding road. I guess the background is I'm a data nerd and I love working with data, building models and using code to do that. And so that was my PhD was actually economics and specifically health economics. And then when I finished my degree, kind of had to make a decision. Do I go into academia? And I thought, hey, this data stuff seems to be pretty valuable to startups and companies. And I decided I didn't want to just be publishing articles forever. And so I instead made a leap into private sector, which, amongst academics is a little looked down on, but I kind of decided, hey, this is right for me. And then from there, I kind of call it just like following the stepping stones. It started in a company that was measuring culture in hospitals. So it scratched that healthcare itch, and then over time shifted to HR technology, leading data science teams and data engineering teams for developing hiring algorithms for recruiters. And then it was always just a hop, and from there shifted to large language models in the context of e-commerce. And for me, it was always what seems like it would be fun and interesting to do next. And initially, it started in data and models. And then somewhere along the way, I decided, listen, I was frustrated because we would build these models and then we'd hand them off to engineers who would have to rebuild them almost from scratch to deploy them to production. And I kind of wondered, well, why do I need someone else to do that? Like, why can't I just do it myself? And it is a hard skill set, but along the way, I learned from some very smart technical minds how to build production grade software and how to deploy it to the cloud and then how to monitor it. And so shifted again from chief data science officer to chief technology officer. And then finally, for me, the application specifically, and I know we're going to talk a lot about fintech and insurtech today, that was almost incidental to the skill set that I was applying. Like I liked building models, I liked deploying to technology to production. But whether it was HR technology, whether it was healthcare, whether it was e-com, whether it was fintech, I always like learning a new subject matter and a new kind of domain. But the skill set that I had learned was always relevant and applicable. And so, yeah, that's kind of I look back. And I will say one more thing, which is I think I'm so grateful with where I've landed, which is I get to I teach about artificial intelligence. I travel the world. I get to help companies with but there was no part of me 15 years ago that said, I'm going to be an AI expert at all, right? Like you never think that in grad school. For me, I think the most interesting and I think the most productive careers are, I'm just going to do this thing seems really interesting to do next. And I'm going to follow that stepping stone. And I've landed in, I think, a pretty amazing place. And I pinch myself regularly that this is what I get to do. So hopefully that gives you some context where people are like, what's this academic? What's this health economics, professor teaching AI? It's like, I don't know how that happened either. So.
But I think that's the beauty of the human experience is that there's no cookie cutter way that that everybody kind of learns and everybody kind of grows, and our journeys are all different. So to hear your journey of how you kind of got there, you just kept going to the next thing that was interesting to you. And I think that's a good model for just anybody who's just starting their career or in the middle of their career saying, hey, what I'm doing isn't interesting. Well, then find something that is interesting and follow that, because otherwise I think we can get easily bored, and that's how things get stagnant and we don't grow in our organizations.
Totally. Yeah. I just think like when I've talked to friends and colleagues, there are some folks who said, I want to be a doctor or a lawyer or whatever, and I'm just going to, move ahead and make that happen. And that
Hmm.
works for some people, but for me, I'm always fascinated with those who just kind of figure out what comes next. And in many cases, steps along the way are not figuring out where you should be, but where you shouldn't be. There were
Yeah.
jobs along the way. I was a consultant out of college because I just followed the herd and I hated it and I was terrible at it. And like that's good learning. I mean, it's a painful,
Yeah.
experience when you don't like your job, but at least you learn, okay, this is what I'm not meant to do. Great, I can check that box off, right? It's done.
Yeah, it's
So,
totally done. And okay, I learned that. I learned the lesson I need to learn. Let's move on to the next thing. Otherwise, 20 years later and you're like, wait, why am I still here?
totally, totally. And just being flexible, malleable, like
Hmm.
pivoting, kind of like a startup. Like you're looking for product market fit for
Hmm.
you as an individual, like the skills you bring and what does the market want from you, right? So,
Well, and thinking about the market, we all have to be understand like the AI is here and we need to understand it and we need to understand how to apply it in our everyday lives and especially in the fintech space. It's like how is, maybe we can talk a little bit about like the inclusion of AI and how is it changing things, and it's changing things very rapidly.
yeah, 100%. I mean, I'd say first and foremost, there's fintech is not dissimilar from HR technology in
Hmm.
that you're making decisions about people, right? Whether someone is credit worthy, whether
Yeah.
they should be issued a payday loan, whether they should be, given credit, so on and so forth. And a lot of it comes down to what signals do we see about the individual that would indicate that they're, credit or loan worthy or whatever it is, and so on and so forth. And what we learned in HR technology and what we've seen in financial technology as well is that those heuristics that have been used by banks and in many cases credit scoring agencies are off in a lot of different ways. And it's the same thing in hiring, right? When you interview recruiters have these heuristics. I'm like, yeah, don't choose job jumpers, people who jump from job to job. Don't you use someone who's unemployed for long bouts of time. We even dispelled some notions about don't hire someone who has a criminal background. And so it's just interesting to me that like humans, we're all biased. There's a long line of research that says we're all biased and we form these rules because we kind of don't want to put the energy involved in thinking, and algorithms cut through that. And so I
Hmm.
love the stories of fintechs that I love are companies that come in and with a creative approach to underscoring and underwriting, or sorry, credit scoring and underwriting, completely upend the market and eat someone else's lunch for them, right? And I'll give
Hmm.
you two clear examples. Like one is the story of Brex, which I tell often is fascinating, right? Which was a couple startup founders that applied for a credit card. And I don't remember what it was, but they were denied a credit card. And these guys have good credit and they had an interesting idea for a startup. And what they realized was that credit cards don't know how to underwrite risk involved in startups, right? You look at and you on the face of it, a startup looks like a terrible risk because it just like swallows up capital and it's cash flow negative for years and years and years until it's not.
Yeah.
And so they came in and they said, we're just going to build a credit card for startups. And they found obviously a huge market because companies, Y Combinators of the world could give them access to entrepreneurs everywhere. And by just understanding that market, they were able to come in and kind of, underwrite that risk properly. And they became a unicorn. It was like almost overnight. And, between us, I've done some strategy sessions and AI teaching to one of the biggest credit card companies in the world post Brex, and they were looking at each other saying, how did this happen? Like that should be ours. How did we miss out on that opportunity? And like for me, I felt bad and I want to help them, but I want to be like, hey, you guys really weren't thinking about this the right way. And some folks came in with some really creative outside the box thinking. So yeah, hopefully that's one example of, and I think that's, anyhow, to your original question, where are the applications in fintech? First and foremost is using the right data to make better decisions about
Hmm.
how to kind of think about risk, and giving access to financial products.
Now, how do we avoid that the bias that you were mentioning? Because the human side of things, we have all these different biases. Like, we judge people by the worst day of their life, the worst decision they made. Like somebody who is like, as an example, somebody who was in prison before, and we say, oh, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this, and not giving them opportunities. And I always ask people when that subject comes up, would you want to be judged by the worst decision you ever made? Well, like, and not everybody's made that, has that, had that opportunity. But if people have made some pretty stupid decisions in their life, and maybe they were never caught, maybe something never happened, how do we get beyond those biases that we have created as humans? Because, we're humans, and, oh, I don't like those people because they wear red shirts and we wear blue shirts, and we're going to sit over here and the blue shirts and the red shirts are going to be separated forever. It's
Yeah.
silly things like that we as humans do.
Yeah, I mean, the answer is it's really hard, right? These biases get reinforced, and it becomes very hard to back out of them. And you can't just change your mind.
Yeah.
It's a really hard thing to do. So I think there's two answers to that. One is teaching people to use kind of more information, and
Mm,
so that's where a big part of my career is it's not human or AI, it's human plus AI, and that
mm,
means recruiters sitting on the front lines, or folks, on the front lines of banks issuing loans, giving them information. We would assess an applicant. We would then render a score, green, yellow, red, and say, hey, hire or issue loans to the greens over the yellows and the reds. But even that is really hard because it can feel like undermining 20 years of, I've sat down with recruiters and they say, listen, egghead, I've been doing this for 20 years. Like, you're no way your algorithm is smarter than me. Like, I've been doing this forever with all the PhDs that you have in the world. And it's really hard to convince people to use that data, but you just try to give them the right education. You try to show them some of the data, and
mhm,
slowly you'll convince people. Um, and then the other thing I would say is sometimes it's not giving more information, but it's how you present it and even withholding information. And as an
mm,
example, like, think about Airbnb had a practice for years. I was friends with their head of people analytics, and they had a really rigorous approach to recruiting. And one of the things they did, especially for developer jobs, is they just withheld the name on the resume. So you'd be screening a resume, but there were pieces of information you couldn't access,
mm.
and you'd be amazed. And what they found was that women and minorities end up being hired with much higher throughput just by virtue of not being able to see names. And so it's
Wow.
like, look, we're biased in these unfortunate ways, and so sometimes let's just hire. I love that because it's like, let's hire on merit. Like, let's just
Mhm,
very, setting aside your feelings on DEI. Like, no one could disagree that if because of hiring purely on resume, knowledge, skills, and abilities, certain, individuals, women and minorities made it through that funnel more effectively, like, that's a no-brainer, right? Why?
mhm.
So yeah, it's the punchline is, like, it's really hard, and the behavioral economists like Danny Kahneman would have very strong opinions about this. But just little nudges like that, withholding this information, providing that information, can actually, research has shown it does have an impact on our behavior.
Yeah, it does have an impact, and you can't deny when you're shown the stats. Well, politicians will deny things till they're blue in the face, even though if they have the stats, but that's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah, yeah,
But when you give business people, like true business people, the stats and the numbers, they're like, oh, I think I do need to change. And I think that's the biggest thing that AI is showing us, that it's showing us the data that we're like, oh wait, I have been doing this wrong. And I think it the next big thing is people admitting that they're wrong and then making the change. And I think that's the hardest thing for humans to do as well.
yeah. I totally agree. I think, I mean, a lot of what I spend my time doing, it's one thing when you put Gen AI tools in people's hands, they are convinced, like, oh, you saved me a day of my
Yeah.
time, you saved me an hour. Like, no one's going to fight that, right? Once you still have to train them,
Hmm.
but there's a different piece, which is what part of what AI does is decision making, right? That's
Yeah.
all about machine learning and saying, hey, this tool can make better decisions because it can just access more and more data than you ever could. And that's much harder. Like, that cuts to the core of what we are, because we're intelligent beings, and
Hmm.
this brain is what separates us from all other mammals on earth. And so it's really hard to then say, oh, there's these algorithms that kind of, are getting smarter than us and are eventually going to be out there, and they will be smarter and conscious, and that's another conversation. But yeah, it's hard. It's hard. The people element, I'll say one more thing, which is like, between the technology and the people, the technology is easier to build. It's people, it's changing behaviors, it's
Hmm.
teaching. That's always the harder piece.
Yeah, it really is. That is the harder piece, because people just, they don't want to change. I mean, you can see the whole library of literature about change management, and that was even before AI was even part of the conversation. And it's not an easy thing to change your way of doing things. And so being able to adjust your thinking and say, hey, this is going to help me, like you're like you can see the like using generative AI in an everyday application, even like things as simple as like I can load my audio from a podcast and I can get a whole analysis of everything we talked about, suggested titles. Like there's so many, it saves me so much time when I'm doing something as simple as this. But in larger applications, you still need the human, like the human plus the artificial to make those very strategic decisions, because we know, I mean, obviously there's a wealth of literature out there of people imagining what would happen if the AI took over. And I think we still need to have that human aspect of being able to still make those decisions, because there's things that the AI can't take into consideration, the human aspect of it.
Yeah, 100%. Absolutely. And yeah, I've heard like AI generated podcasts and like the pure AI. So look, here's the good news, Adam, is you're not out of a job anytime soon, because I've heard them with the AI generated voices and they're not really engaging. They just don't
No.
hit the nerve. But I would argue that like, podcasts are doing research with AI tools, knowing what questions to ask, maybe being prompted like that. I haven't seen the state of the art, but I think that is kind of is where it's headed, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's both harnessing the power of that technology.
Yeah, it saves you time. Now, when we're talking about fintech and AI, one of the biggest things, one of the biggest spaces that people are talking about is stuff like fraud detection. Have you had any experience in that? Can we talk a little about some examples you've seen in that space?
Yeah, I did. I spent a couple of years doing fraud detection for large banks, basically that were issuing loans. And I will say overall, it's such a cool space just because it's like cops and robbers with data. So you're like
Yeah.
fighting the good fight. There are fraudsters out there that are looking to take advantage of not just banks, but because they're doing what they're doing, banks are then, they add stipulations to like we submit a loan application and banks kind of sniff that a lot more closely because of
Yeah.
fraudsters. And so yeah, and for me, it was the punchline was it was human plus machine, which is the same theme. And I'll give you the example, which is if fraudsters would find a new attack vector, right? They'd find some new way of perpetrating fraud. Oh, guess what? They don't check your employer. So we can create a fake employer and everyone starts using that fake employer. It's like, I think it was like Bob's Big Tires was like one that we found. And everyone started using that one. And all of a sudden we found a big influx of fraud applications. The algorithms wouldn't find that sight unseen. Like there's
Mm-hmm.
just, you need a human intuition. Like we'd start looking for fraud rings and we'd see
Mm-hmm.
patterns in the data and we'd see people trading information. And then all of a sudden you'd see that employer and you say, hey, let's dig into that one specifically. You'd have analysts that were trained and they'd find, oh yeah, that's a new thing that they've discovered. And then they would find it, but then you need to render these decisions within a sub-second response time. So they would take that information. You have a fraud team, and they would take that information to my team, which is technology, and we very quickly have to build rules and deploy them to stop that fraud from occurring. And so it's a fun partnership to have folks in the data unearthing interesting trends and then sharing it with the data science and technology team so they could plug it in and plug the holes. And frankly, that's how every company doing fraud functions, which is you have the human analysts that are just constantly looking for bad behavior. And then you have the machine element because they're the ones that, have to make a decision very, very quickly on an application. So that was for me one of the coolest things. And the other thing I'll say is I went at that job. I was very naive when I started that job. And so, because I've never done this stuff, right? I've never been on the dark web before. And so we had a chief fraud officer who his job is to understand how criminals think.
Wow.
And so I remember early in the conversation, early in my time there, he kind of came to me and was like, oh yeah, we need to be, there's a blacklist of social security numbers that are never, we just know are like fraudulent. And I kind of looked at him and I was like, wait, you can buy a social security number online? And he looked at me like, oh, sweet child of mine. Like, you don't understand. Like, you have no idea what folks are trading in those black markets. So, lesson learned. Like, you need to understand the terrain and you need to spend the time I don't know if I went on the dark web, but I definitely picked his brain a lot around what people are doing to defraud folks like you and me.
Yeah. Well, and there's so many new schemes, for every blocker that you put up, I'm sure that the fraudsters come up with three more. So it's that ability to be agile is more important than ever within your organization.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. You needed to move very quickly to catch
Hmm.
that, and that's even those were certain types of loans. Credit cards, they're even
Yeah.
more nimble, right? There's just a zillion different ways. That's so hard to do. So, but yeah, it was fun to like when you're working on projects like that where you're building technology, but it's helping not just banks but folks that are applying for loans. I
Yeah.
felt I felt really good about kind of the work we did there.
So, what should finance and accounting organizations, what should they be doing to help protect themselves? Because if you're a team and you're receiving payments for services or for goods or whatever, what steps can you take to help prevent those frauds from happening? Obviously, you can partner with organizations to help catch those things, but are there certain steps that you should be taking to help prevent that within your organization?
Yeah, I mean, I think at a minimum, you need to have designed algorithms and technologies to
Hmm.
especially be looking at fraud. Like companies like Stripe, I have a friend of mine who does fraud detection at Stripe, and they just
Yeah.
have armies of data scientists that are constantly on the lookout for fraudulent behavior. Now, that said, it's hard if you're a smaller company, you don't have the resources of a Stripe or a Cabbage
Yeah.
or any of the big fintechs. You can start to build the capabilities, or the good news is there are plenty of algorithms and SaaS software tools that will help you buy it, right, and insource it or kind of outsource it. And so
Yeah.
that's, I think, I was talking yesterday with a very, very, very early fintech, and they will have a novel approach to lending, and it's something they needed to think about. They're on kind of day zero. They're trying to launch a product, and I was like, there are going to be, I know you have the best of intentions, but there are going to be folks out there looking to steal money from you. So you can't punt on that. You need to at least give some thought to who can help. And the
Hmm.
good, like I said, the good news is like the work we did at Point Predictive, you leverage the power of the network, and by
Yeah.
that I mean they have so many clients. Like if you're Visa or Amex or MasterCard, you're looking at one slice of the pie, and there are companies that work across them to say, listen, we know what the network looks like. So you're not looking at one piece of it, you're looking at all these transactions. And so, but yeah, the point is you need to be thinking about this stuff early on if you're in the business of, any sort of risk adjusting, issuing
Hmm.
insurance, same deal. Insurance fraud is a thing. Like any fintech, any insurtech needs to be thinking about it from day zero.
Yeah. So what about just things like internal AI policies? What has been your experience of that, and are there some best practices you can share with the audience about having your internal people starting to use these? Because generative AI, like I can just go to Google right now, get on Gemini, and say, hey, like analyze this for me. Not that I should be putting our internal company documents in a generative AI, but like what are some internal policies that you've seen that have worked well?
Yeah, I mean, companies that I've spoken to that seem to have a really good handle on this, they kind
Hmm.
of take two different approaches. And one
Yeah.
is they call it like top down and bottom up. And the top down is the traditional, listen, we're going to identify. Well, let me back up. The bottom up is we're going to empower our employees. They're going to get a certain AI budget that they can, that's like credit card, like small ish
Okay.
budget, encourage them to experiment, recognizing that, hey, we need to have certain rules around what data can be disclosed. You need to be really buttoned up if you're healthcare or financial application,
Of
but
course.
allowing them, especially your knowledge workers, to look for tools that could enhance their productivity and saying, hey, we want to empower you. Like, go find something. If you find it, here's a Slack thread. Send it out to everyone and let people know that you found something that's, making you 5, 10, 20% more productive. So that's the bottoms up. And then for the top down, there are applications and tools you can't just, implement on a one-off basis. You can't use a credit card to pay for them. And so you have to design pilots. But I think the best companies have almost like an AI steering committee. And that committee has a certain budget, and they have certain objectives that have been set out, and they're going from one application to another, designing POCs, testing them out, and then assessing, is this successful or not. And so the most successful companies I'm seeing are taking both of those
Mm.
approaches, and and they're seeing some real clear wins. So I know right now there's a question of like, where's all this investment going and where's the benefit? And I I do know companies that are benefiting, but it has to be done in a really intentional and strategic way.
It really does, because it's very easy to get in there and just have at it, but you need to, if you don't understand about hallucinations, if you don't understand about the limitations of the current systems, you
Yeah.
could potentially be putting things out there that aren't true, things that are false, things that don't connect with what you're building. But if you understand those things, the capabilities are pretty much endless. I mean, it helps us do our jobs in so many different ways that I don't think people could completely realize the capabilities that are out there for them.
Yeah, 100%. I just got talking to a very large pharma right now, and we're totally revamping the way they do market research because it's very
Hmm.
manual, and they use Google, and they use these like kind of now antiquated tools. And we're
Yeah.
showing them, listen, when you're doing research, there are some AI native tools like Perplexity
Yeah.
and Gemini. When you're doing writing and synthesis, there are other tools like Claude and ChatGPT.
Hmm.
And we're teaching their people how to do it. And the truth is, like, there's such a boost in what they can do and their productivity when they're harnessing the power. But they have to understand what are the trade-offs, what are the things you have to be worried about, what
Hmm.
information should you not send to an LLM. So yeah, there's a big training component. Like half
Yeah.
a small part of the project was figuring out their workflow and then figuring out the tools. The bigger part is let's put it in people's hands, retrain them, make sure they're following it.
So, speaking of that example you just said, what are some red flags that people can look for when they're kind of working with their employees and doing something like that? Or we've already talked about the biases that you need to look for and stuff like that. But what are other red flags we should be looking for when you're utilizing different AI systems within organizations?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would be trying to understand. There are a lot of wrapper tools. Well, I mean,
Hmm.
first off, there's kind of the typical due diligence that comes with SaaS tools, which is make sure you're cognizant of kind of terms and conditions and what data could be shared with whom,
Yeah.
right? There are a lot of wrappers out there. And so I get intimately familiar with what are they actually building in the way of kind of novel IP, like in the way of LLMs. How much of that is just a wrapper on top of an API that's been published by a Chat GPT or Claude or whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
Um, and then yeah, I would also just experiment with kind of what how good are the outputs you get out of these tools. And so just being mindful of that, and then also developing some robust internal policies around data privacy and security. And I think there are horror stories out there of coders that shared proprietary code with ChatGPT, and I think Samsung had a black eye because of this, a number of months ago, because
Yeah.
some code and some data got kind of leaked. Um, so I just think you need to do your proper like due diligence, be
Hmm.
really buttoned up about that, but then also make sure that whatever employees are experimenting with these tools, they kind of understand the rules of engagement, right? And they're cognizant of like what is on and off limits when it's talking to an LLM. Yeah, those are the big ones. And then the last piece I would say is, what's your margin for error? This is where I'm spending a lot of time these days, is thinking about like, okay, functions like tax and audit,
Hmm.
even lawyering, like you have a very small margin for error. LLMs are amazing, but you can't afford for them to make things up, right? Hallucinations and certain things, you can't just make up your audit, you can't just make up your tax return. So you try to figure out, okay, like how can we build processes where there's an LLM, it's supplemented by humans, where you're still faster, but you're verifying what's coming out of the LLM. And so that's what
Hmm.
we're spending a lot of time doing now.
I think that's a huge market right now, is spending the time verifying what's coming out, make understanding that you're doing it right. And then I think that's where a lot of the wrappers come in, where, hey, we're going to take this and we're going to make sure that it makes sense for you. But again, you have to understand where it's coming from. Like, hey, I'm going to use this system, and realizing, wait, it's just ChatGPT, so I can just pay ChatGPT to do it myself. But
Yeah.
then what other benefits are coming from that vendor if they're utilizing it?
Yeah, 100%. That's I think there are these point applications that are useful, but I think folks need to peel the onion a little bit and understand,
Hmm.
what additional value are they creating? Are they fine tuning this model, or are they kind of just spitting out this generic API response?
Yeah, definitely. So, as we kind of wrap up the conversation, what are we looking at toward the future as we look forward, as you look forward, with all the, the organizations you deal with and what you're seeing day to day, what's coming up around the corner that we should be aware of and we should be mindful of?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple things. Like number one, we're now seeing the AI backlash. It was inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
You're starting seeing reports. We poured $600 billion in venture capital funding towards AI because we tend to be very, folks tend to jump on bandwagons, and it was like,
yeah,
it was crypto and Web3 3 to 5 years ago, and then everyone's like, oh my God, AI is going to. So, it was inevitable that folks were going to start to say, hey, wait a second, what is this buying us? And
mm-hmm.
I don't think. And that's fine if there's a little bit of skepticism now. I think I see a ton of enterprise value being built, and it's by companies that are thoughtful and deliberate and saying, listen, we have this complex process. We're going to pull it apart. We're going to find where are the low-hanging fruit in terms of adding in ML and AI to automate and augment our people. And I'm already seeing companies improve their processes and like sprint ahead of their competition by doing that. So I think that's, in the short term, you're going to see a ton of value created, but it's not by the like toys and the magic tricks that you see online. It's by companies that are really thoughtful, that are saying, hey, we're going to go on this multi-year journey together. And I think where that leads is, I tell everyone, these technologies scale intelligence. That means knowledge workers, frankly, like you and me, Adam, are kind of at risk. And I don't think it takes our jobs anytime soon, but it is going to change our jobs. Mm-hmm. And I think companies with a lot of knowledge workers need to be thinking about this now, and starting to like head down this AI, journey, like building. And this is, I've spent a lot of my time building AI roadmaps for companies that employ a lot of knowledge workers because they see the writing on the wall, and they recognize that if your business model is, and this, by the way, AI-ccelerator, my firm, like we rent out developers and data scientists and engineers, like that's our model. If that's your job, to rent out talent, you got to be able to adapt. And so I see companies hopefully the winning companies are taking that seriously, that see this as a threat and are trying to think about how to disrupt their own businesses before they get disrupted. And so that's where I see it headed. And then it's probably a separate podcast over drinks where we talk about whether they'll become self-aware, conscious, will take all our jobs and our lives. But yeah, I'm seeing a lot of like, it's an exciting time because the companies I'm working with are really digging in and saying, okay, this is a huge opportunity. And I'm starting to see them really realize that and sprinting ahead of the competition because, the competition is taking a wait and see approach.
Yeah. Well, so I appreciate that advice, and I hope everybody takes that to heart. Be agile, be ready for what's coming because you don't know what's coming, and you gotta just be ready because things are going to be changing very rapidly, and don't get caught on the back of your heels, basically.
Mm-hmm. Totally agree. Love it.
Yeah. Well, Mike, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate you sharing everything with the audience, and your insights is just so invaluable. We really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Adam.
This has been Count Me In, IMA's podcast, providing you with the latest perspectives of thought leaders from the accounting and finance profession. If you like what you heard and you'd like to be counted in for more relevant accounting and finance education, visit IMA's website at www.imanet.org.